Welcome all, and thank you for joining this VBA presentation on performance solutions. I'm Andrew Cellini, the State Building Surveyor with the Victorian Building Authority. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live, and recognise their continuing connection to land, water, community. I pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. Just in regards to this presentation, it's one of a series of presentations the VBA is undertaking in relation to performance solutions. We've previously presented for building surveyors a couple of presentations, and this one with another one following on is targeted at architects and builders. We see that performance solutions are increasing not only in practice, but from the regulators. ABCB have sort of identified performance solutions as a key component of future regulatory environment. And they are currently proposing some additional amendments to further clarify how performance solutions should be documented and processed. So we thought it was opportune to provide this presentation to provide some further clarity on the process and what is expected, and I think importantly what the roles are of the various practitioners within the process of performance solutions. With the introduction of the Code of Conduct for Building Surveyors, there'll be more focus on the processes that building surveyors go through. One of the core principles within the Code of Conduct is that a relevant building surveyor needs to be independent of the process and checking and warranting the compliance of the design. So they shouldn't be actually involved actively in the design, only providing routine and general advice. So we're aware that some building surveyors are providing performance solutions and documentation and performance solutions, and that's something that does not sort of meet the independence requirement of a RBS. So I hope you enjoy this presentation. It'll run for about 45 minutes with 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end. You've all joined in a listen-only mode. There will be the opportunity for you to ask questions via the chat window. So if you'd like to open that and provide questions as we go, and we'll also be looking at answering those in that 15-minute interval at the end, and hopefully we can get across as many as we can. There were a number of questions prior to the event as well. I appreciate all those that provided that feedback. I think some of those are probably broader than this particular topic, but are good for us to appreciate the typical questions that you have, and will help inform future presentations and guidance material that we hope to be able to present. Very keen to sort of hear what the needs are of industry in general. I'd like to now introduce Matt Waters, Team Leader of Building Audit from the VBA Tech and Reg team, to undertake the presentation, and I'll join you again at the end. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to go through a bit of an overview before we get started on what we have planned for this afternoon seminar. So part one, we're going to take a look at the mandatory governing requirements of Section A of the BCA. So we're really going to look at the governing rules that outline how the BCA must be used and the process that must be followed, and particularly looking at it in the context of performance solutions. Part two, we're going to deal with the fundamentals of performance solutions. So we're going to be looking at some of the background and key concepts that underpin the performance solution pathway. Part three, we're going to deal with the roles and responsibilities of key stakeholders in the performance solution process. So really looking at everyone's responsibility in the development and implementation of performance-based solutions. Part four, we're going to look at some examples of, or look at a specific example of the development of a performance solution. And we'll be applying the performance solution process to a surface water drainage matter for a Class 1A single dwelling. So just to really go through the recommended process and how that looks to a real scenario. We're also going to look at some code mark certificates and some issues that probably a lot of you face in terms of holistic compliance with the BCA provisions and some things to look out for when specifying and using products that are subject to code mark certificates. So we'll kick off with part one, the BCA governing requirements. So most of us will probably be aware, but to comply with the requirements of the NCC, which I'm just going to call the BCA from here because we're solely concerned with the Building Code of Australia, we must achieve compliance with the governing requirements and the performance requirements. So they're the mandatory requirements, and we cannot comply with the building code unless we meet those requirements. The governing requirements is what contains all the rules about how performance requirements must be met, whilst the performance requirements provide us with the minimum level of performance that the building or building elements must meet. The governing requirements are really considered as the administrative provisions, so they outline how everything has to be done, and then the performance requirements are considered to be the technical provisions. It's just generally how the compliance framework works. So it's really a shift from prescriptive legislation in the mid-90s to a performance-based BCA. In terms of deemed to satisfy solutions, I'll refer to it here on in as DTS. They're essentially the building solutions that we all know that are the prescriptive requirements of the BCA. In terms of how the BCA operates with DTS provisions, it deems that they meet certain performance requirements, and that's why they're called deemed to satisfy provisions. So they're deemed to satisfy the performance requirements. For deemed to satisfy solutions, we have two assessment methods that we may use to demonstrate compliance, and they're evidence of suitability in accordance with Part A5, or expert judgment, or a combination of both, and they're shown on the screen. I'm going to really talk about the assessment methods and what each of them entails shortly. Performance solutions, on the other hand, are solutions that don't comply with the deemed to satisfy provisions, and that might be due to a number of reasons. So it might be a buildability component, or because there might be no deemed to satisfy provisions at all to meet a performance requirement. Now, with a performance solution, there's two ways that it can be achieved, and that's via a first principle approach, which is where we basically do a direct assessment directly against the performance requirement, or we do a benchmark approach, which is where the solution is assessed against the deemed to satisfy provisions, and it's looking for equivalence. So is it at least equivalent or better than the deemed to satisfy? Now, with the benchmark approach, that's recognising that the BCA already accepts the deemed to satisfy requirements as meeting the performance requirements, like I just discussed. So that's kind of how that fits in. In terms of the assessment methods for a performance solution, we can use a number of one or more of either evidence of suitability, which is the same as what's available under the deemed to satisfy. We can use a comparison with deemed to satisfy. We can also use expert judgment, and we can use some verification methods, and they can be either ones provided for in the BCA or ones provided outside the BCA. The pathway chosen in terms of the assessment method that's used will really depend on the complexity of the solution, the stringency of the deemed to satisfy provisions, and the nature of the performance requirements. So whether the performance requirements are written in qualitative or quantitative terms, which is very important in terms of how they're benchmarked and how you're ascertaining compliance. There are quite often, most of the time, scenarios where a combination of solutions is used to achieve compliance with performance requirements. And this can be multiple performance requirements or individual performance requirements. We normally use a combination where there is a specific performance requirement that covers a number of elements in the buildings. So when we use a combination, we need to follow the process that the BCA prescribes. And that first involves us identifying the deemed to satisfy provisions that are going to be subject to our performance solution. Then we're looking at the performance requirements that are relevant to the deemed to satisfy provisions. So it requires a bit of analysis on what's actually applicable and what deemed to satisfy aligns with the performance requirements. And then our third step is we identify other deemed to satisfy provisions and performance requirements that might be affected. And that's really looking at how the BCA implements redundancies and how often deemed to satisfy provisions are reliant on other aspects being implemented to achieve the required level of safety or health and amenity. If we applied this scenario to something like a stairway in a volume 1 context, we would identify that our performance requirement is DP2, and that applies to the design and construction of stairways. We could apply a combination of solutions to something like have a deemed to satisfy solution for our riser and going dimensions, and then we might use a performance solution to address slip resistance. So our deemed to satisfy aspect could be verified through the architectural plans, which would demonstrate the dimensions. However, our performance solution aspect, we'd need to demonstrate that by one or more of the assessment methods that I just mentioned. So that could be a comparison with the deemed to satisfy slip resistant provisions and coming up with some analysis on whether it's equivalent or better than. So the use of assessment methods must be documented to show that a solution complies with either the deemed to satisfy provisions or the performance requirements. And the documentation needs to be collated in a way that clearly demonstrates to the building surveyor what was completed. And this really is important so they can understand the information and then accept that. Evidence of suitability is the first one we're going to discuss, and it's basically documentary evidence. And it contains the options that we can use as evidence to support that either materials, products, form of construction or designs meet the requirements of the BCA. The type of evidence really relates to the specific circumstances where found. So for example, we might have some products that have very limited Australian application historically, and therefore there's a real unknown consequence in terms of failure, and it might require a higher level of evidence. While something that has been used in an Australian context for some time might require less extensive forms of evidence to be accepted. And that's where things like your code mark certificates, your Building Regulation Advisory Council certificates, so your BRAC certificates, certificates from registered engineers or reports from engineers, those types of things are the evidence of suitability that can be used to verify compliance. Comparison with DTS involves a comparative analysis that's demonstrating that our performance solution is better than or equivalent to the deemed to satisfy. Now, what we need to do here is we basically subject our deemed to satisfy provisions and our performance solution to the same level of analysis, and we have to use the exact same methodology. What this does is it provides us with a benchmark of our DTS provision, and then we can compare our performance solution against it, and then basically make a decision about if it's better. Verification methods are tests or calculations that prescribe other ways in which a solution complies with the performance requirements. They can take a number of forms, and they're things like tests, inspections, calculations, or a combination of these in some circumstances. The thing about verification methods is they're relatively similar to deemed to satisfy provisions in terms of they normally give a quantifiable benchmark or a predetermined acceptable criteria that the solution must achieve. So there are some verification methods in the BCA, and when they're in the BCA, they clearly identify the performance requirements or the part of a performance requirement that they're meeting. Our last assessment method is expert judgment, and that's the opinion of an expert, and it may be accepted in certain circumstances, and it's basically where you have a person who has the necessary qualifications and experience on a specific topic, and we're using that judgment to determine whether a performance solution or deemed to satisfy solution complies. So they really need to be generally a subject matter expert or someone who has the qualification and experience on a particular topic in order to pass judgment. So we're moving on to our second part, which is fundamentals of performance solutions. The first part I really want to talk about today when it comes to performance solutions is the concept of risk assessment and management, and really how it differs between a performance solution and a deemed to satisfy solution. I think it's really important to understand that it's very different between a deemed to satisfy solution and a performance solution in terms of the structure and the processes that are required to manage the solution. When we consider the deemed to satisfy provisions, it's essentially the codification of existing practices that were found to be acceptable over historic timeframes. So they're recognised by government as being acceptable solutions, hence they're adopted via the legislation. And they're given that deeming nature that I discussed before, so they're deemed to satisfy the performance requirements. What happens with the DTS is as failures or opportunities for improvement are identified, the DTS provisions incrementally shift to incorporate the necessary changes to achieve the desired objectives. So we can see an example of this recently occurring from the 1st of July this year, where there were some amendments made to the BCA to clarify some concessions provided regarding low-rise timber frame construction in class 2 and 3 buildings. If we look at this in contrast to performance solution, it differs vastly, because with a performance solution, it might be the first time that our design, a material or a form of construction has been trialled. So it's really important that we understand how the risk changes, and the process and structure that are needed to manage a performance solution is just different from that of a deemed to satisfy solution. So it requires us to be extremely conscious of this fact. If we look at risk, it's defined in Australian standards as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And if we looked at this and how this applied to performance and DTS, we generally established that there's less uncertainty with the DTS provisions as they've already been accepted by government. So they're already deemed to satisfy the performance requirements, and from our perspective, there's nothing further we need to do because the code's already ascertained that for us. As we move to the performance space, we can say that the uncertainty rises, and then so does the risk level. So we need to really ensure that any performance solutions we're documenting and justifying are appropriately managed. This concept really aligns with the proposed future inclusion of a definition for building complexity, which is going to be brought into the BCA, which considers attributes that are complicated or organisational and increase the likelihood of non-compliance. So what I'm getting at is just that we need to understand that we go from a situation of real certainty with deemed to satisfy to performance, which in some instances is quite uncertain. So sometimes we need a higher level of documentation and evidence to suggest that our solution complies. I've got a flowchart on the screen that is a real simple way that we can establish if a building solution is either performance or deemed to satisfy. Now, if we looked at this in a volume 2 context, there really needs to be either an acceptable construction practice or manual, so an ACP or an ACM, and it needs to comply with one of these. So if something's not covered by the deemed to satisfy provision, so a material, for instance, or if it's out the scope, so if it limits something to 3 metres and it's 4 metres, then it's simply into the performance solution territory. So really an example of this is something like expanded polystyrene cladding, where there's no deemed to satisfy provisions for elements such as structural resistance, fire and weatherproofing, for instance. So that would require us to develop a performance solution to meet several performance requirements that would be applicable. There are some unique situations in the BCA where there are no deemed to satisfy provisions at all, which means to meet certain performance requirements, a performance solution is always required, and we're going to discuss that briefly now. Now, this is an extract of FP 1.4, which is a performance requirement for weatherproofing in Volume 1. Lots of people might be aware that in Volume 1, there's no deemed to satisfy provisions to meet FP 1.4 for an external wall. And what this means is the performance solution must be completed for all external walls for class 2 to 9 buildings, unless we can use a limitation. So these situations are really automatic performance solutions because we have no alternative option. We must use a performance solution. So there's no ability to use DTS. So if we read FP 1.4, we can see it has some limitations, and these are really regarding 7 and 8 buildings, so class 7 and 8 buildings. However, we need to make some judgment to confirm whether there's a necessity for compliance or not. So what this means is for some class 7 and 8 buildings, we might require compliance, and it might be due to the nature of the goods stored or some activities that are undertaken within the building. So it's important to understand that it's not an automatic exemption. And an appropriate example of this could be something like a car park, for instance. And it would be unreasonable to require an external wall to comply with these provisions. So it would be reasonable to not apply FP 1.4. In the audits the VBA has undertaken into commercial buildings, we very rarely see performance solutions documented for weatherproofing compliance. The only situations we typically see are via the use of code mark certificates. However, they often lack holistic consideration, and there's some element that's lacking. This is extremely important in wider international contexts, and we can draw parallels with New Zealand's leaky building syndrome, which cost in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and really the potential impacts if performance solutions aren't adequately documented. Now, I want to quickly talk about the way that performance requirements are written, and they're written in either qualitative or quantitative terms. So we have two performance requirements that are shown on the screen, and we've got Vic FP 3.1, which deals for room and space size, and this is a Victorian specific provision. And we also have FP 1.2, which deals with rainwater. Now, when we read FP 3.1, we can see that there's no minimum size provided under the performance requirement. So it's written in a qualitative term. So we can essentially have flexibility in terms of determining the size of the room or space that's sufficient. You can see that it uses the word must in regard to it being a sufficient size to fulfill its intended function. And this is really the condition that we must achieve to demonstrate compliance with the performance requirement. When we read FP 1.2 in contrast, we can see that it's quantitative as it provides an absolute measure in the drafting of the provision. So the performance requirement provides a measure, and that's that surface water from a 1 in 100 year storm event must not enter the building. There's obviously the same flexibility in terms of how we document our compliance solution. It's just that the condition, which in this instance is the average recurrence interval, has been quantified. So the way this is approached is that when we're developing our performance solution, we must take into consideration this requirement, and it can't be ignored. So that's basically how the qualitative and quantitative nature can differ your approach. So in the quantitative one, you can't ignore the absolute measure that's provided in the performance requirement. There's some really key expressions that are used in performance requirements, and these are called to the degree necessary and appropriate to. And what these do is they provide flexibility by allowing the appropriate authority, so most instances the building surveyor, to determine the degree of compliance necessary in a particular case. Now, performance requirements may not have universal application, and this is called case and condition appropriate to drafting. What this does is it limits the operation of the performance requirements, and we have a case that identifies the circumstances in which the performance requirements are triggered, and then the condition identifies the requirements that we must meet. So we have an example on the screen of EP 1.4, and this deals with automatic suppression. And we've selected this because it contains both of these expressions. Now we're going to break down the performance requirement, and we can really analyse how this changes how you read it and the considerations that are made. So firstly, an automatic fire suppression system must be installed to the degree necessary. Now what this really means is that you do not necessarily need to install the system if you can demonstrate it's not required. So this is the case statement in our performance requirement. The next part says to control the development and spread of fire. And this is explaining why a system is required to be installed. So if we look at this further, if the same result can be achieved by a performance solution, there'll be no need to install an automatic fire suppression system. We then get to appropriate to, and this lists 4 different matters that need to be considered in the development of any performance solution. Now, this is a condition statement as well, and these criteria are set to acknowledge the situational nature and how the outcome can be altered significantly by the physical characteristics in the building. So if we look at B, for instance, which is the function or use of the building, depending on what our building's used for, it could significantly impact on the suitability of a performance solution, and whether a system is or not required or whether it's effective could change dramatically. So by breaking down the wording, we've really found out a significant amount of information on what must be taken into consideration to meet this performance requirement. So that's essentially how it needs to be approached when we're considering performance-based design. So really breaking down and figuring out exactly what needs to be provided and what the performance requirements making us consider. Now, earlier we discussed that performance solutions must be assessed according to one or more of the assessment methods in the BCA. And we're going to focus on the use of CV3 briefly, which is relatively new, and it can be used to verify compliance with performance requirement CP2 to avoid the spread of fire. Now, this verification method requires the use of Australian standard AS5113, and some people may have heard about this standard. It's the full-scale test standard, the full-scale fire test standard, and it sets out the procedures for testing and classifying external walls. Now, when we use CV3, it's really important to understand that passing the standard and achieving an EW classification, so an external wall classification, isn't sufficient on its own, and there are other provisions that need to be met, and they're outlined in the verification method. So when we read verification methods, we really need to understand that there's generally more than one requirement, and we can't pick and choose. We have to select everything and make sure we're complying with every element. So the specific requirements in this instance that must be met deal with fire spread between buildings. So if there's other buildings on the allotment, or we're close to an allotment boundary. There's also external wall system requirements, which is our 5113 test. And then we also have building requirements, which is if we have a building of type A construction, for instance, so multi-storey, the building must have a AS2118 sprinkler system, and it must have protection to specific areas. So that's essentially what we must take into consideration. Now, although a verification method is a performance solution, it is very similar to a prescriptive deemed to satisfy provision, as you can only verify compliance when we're meeting everything that the verification method specifies. Importantly, if we depart from any specific requirement that's required to be implemented in a verification method, it would require us to provide detailed justification under a tailored performance solution. So potentially we could use a component of a verification method. However, it would need to be supplemented by justification that the other elements weren't required for whatever reason that was. So if we're specifying aspects that have that use or claim compliance against standards, for instance, really important to understand that those other elements are very important and they need to be provided. For several years, the Australian Building Codes Board have produced guidance material for formulating performance solutions. They basically suggest a collaborative approach that enables us to agree on the pathway to follow, and this really facilitates acceptable outcomes. Now, in the Amendment 1, which came in 1st of July, so last week, to 2019 BCA, or the NCC, it introduced a 4-step process that must be used from the 1st of July 2021. So 1st of July next year, a building surveyor must ensure this process is followed, as it forms part of the governing requirements, which, as I talked about before, they're mandatory. This process doesn't need to be complicated, and for some performance solutions, so for things that utilise aspects like code mark certificates under a performance solution, it can be extremely simple. But we're going to discuss this now, as it's the VBA's opinion that this process should be followed. Now, the first step is called performance-based design brief, and it's basically we prepare a brief in consultation with the relevant stakeholders. It's basically the most critical part of our performance solution process, as it documents what will be done, the methods that will be used to assess the proposal, and it establishes the acceptance criteria, which is what outcomes the design panel are considering are acceptable. Now, when it's finalised, all the critical activities and outcomes would have been identified, and it allows us to actually commence the design process with a high degree of confidence that as long as we meet the requirements of the brief, so we satisfy our acceptance criteria, the proposed design is likely to be approved. So it gives that certainty from the start of the process. Our second step is that we carry out analysis, and that's using whatever assessment methods have been proposed by the performance-based design brief. So one of those, or one or a combination of those 4 that I mentioned earlier. The method selected will be selected by the design team, and it will basically be discussed by the stakeholder group and then documented in the brief. The third step is where the results that are carried out in step 2 are compared against the acceptance criteria. So if the results are aligning with the acceptance criteria, so they satisfy it or they're better than, simply the design should be approved. If the results do not align, then we generally step back to step 2, and then we'd need to repeat further analysis. So it might require us using different methods or slightly altering our design that we initially proposed. In step 4, we prepare a final report, and this details the process that we followed and then the outcomes. So this has to include the performance requirements and the deemed to satisfy provisions that have been identified as being relevant, the assessment methods that we've used in our analysis, a summary of the first 3 steps, confirmation that the performance requirements have been met, and then it needs to give details of any limitations on the performance solution. Now, that's critical in terms of understanding any aspects that the builder might need to be aware of when they're implementing the solution on site, and also some flow-on effects in terms of maintenance obligations that might be imposed by the performance solution. It's really important for everyone to understand that the brief, the analysis, evaluation, the final report should be undertaken outside of the RBS, so the relevant building surveyor who's engaged to perform functions on the project. We're going to discuss the Building Surveyor's Code of Conduct briefly later. However, generally a building surveyor has limitations on being involved in the design. And in the scenarios where a building surveyor's involvement is required, it's suggested that a consultant building surveyor might be engaged to assist in providing that regulatory advice. Okay, so we're into part 3, which is talking about the roles and responsibilities of key parties. There are 2 concepts that I want to quickly talk about, which are called the burden of proof and the standard of proof. And these are important because they relate to the way the system operates. So if we looked at a legal case, for instance, one side has the burden of proof, meaning they have to prove the case. And then the standard of proof really refers to the extent that the side with the burden of proof has to prove its case. So what type of documentation is to be provided for it to be sufficient. Now, in terms of the burden of proof, in a building context, it's not the building surveyor's responsibility to prove a proposal complies. that burden is on the person making the claims of compliance, so the design team and the applicant. The RBS has a responsibility of assessing compliance and issuing a permit after they're satisfied the building work complies, and that's once it's been proven to comply by the applicant's submission. Obviously, the building surveyor has to be able to document their decision-making process and how they satisfied themselves that the building work complied. Now, the standard that must be provided to the building surveyor needs to be sufficient for them to be satisfied that it will comply with the performance requirements. The standard of proof is basically provided in section 24(1)(a) of the Building Act, where the building surveyor can't issue a building permit unless they're satisfied that the work will comply. We also have regulation 24 and 25 in the Building Regulations 2018, and this requires an application for building permit to include sufficient information to show that the work will comply with the Act and regulations. Now, every performance solution will require a different standard of proof, as performance solutions are obviously unique, as the outcome depends on the unique situations that are present. It'll also depend on the individual building surveyor and things like their risk tolerance and risk appetite. Now, each party has clear responsibilities in the performance solution process, and we're going to look at this now in some depth. Now, basically, the owner engages designers to design the building or develop the building design. Generally, this is accompanied by some type of client brief that outlines what they expect from the building. Importantly, this isn't the owner's only involvement, and they should be involved throughout the performance solution process to ensure they understand wider considerations and implications, which is things like life cycle implications, for instance. Now, the designers, such as the architect, the building designers, engineers, they consider the client brief and they develop the design. It's at this point where we can start to recommend performance solutions based on the unique circumstances that are presented. So the client brief, for instance, might be to maximise net lettable area in the building, and certain solutions might be proposed by the design team to facilitate achieving this over a deemed to satisfy approach. It's really important that the owner is involved in all of these conversations, and this is really no different than owners' decisions for other design features and finishes. The owner needs to understand all the implications that the design may impose, and this enables them to make an informed decision on whether they want to proceed and what conditions they are considering to be acceptable. The consultant building surveyor is essentially a building surveyor who is not undertaking functions and is therefore not the relevant building surveyor on the project. They don't have the same restrictions that are imposed in terms of not providing advice, as they're not undertaking the function. So they can provide their opinion on the design and what aspects may or may not be acceptable. The statutory building surveyor, who's the relevant building surveyor, so the RBS, they're the one undertaking the functions under the Act, and they're prohibited from being involved in the design. The main rationale really for wanting the RBS to be involved in the performance solution process is largely because they're the one accepting the proposal. And second, they might be able to suggest compliance solutions based on their experiences with similar projects and similar things that they've seen that have been effective. In terms of their involvement, the building surveyor, who's the RBS, shouldn't suggest compliance solutions. However, it's important that they understand the pathway so they can be involved to provide commentary on whether they'll accept the performance solution if the acceptance criteria has been met. The builder is obviously responsible for implementing the design, and they need to consider the impacts that a performance solution might have on the construction. So if anything's not on the drawings, but it's in a technical report, for instance, that might need to be considered. The maintenance contractors need to be aware of non-standard maintenance requirements, and to assist with this, the essential safety measure requirements must be documented by the RBS in terms of a maintenance determination. In our experience with cladding audits, many performance solutions rely on additional active systems that have been poorly maintained and compromise the effectiveness of the solution. And generally that's due to maintenance costs and the avoidance of costs. So extremely important that owners are aware of all those requirements. The VBA has recently released a code of conduct for building surveyors, and this is enforceable from the 1st of January 2021, and it sets out basically examples of inappropriate conduct and establishes some areas of professional conduct that building surveyors must follow. Building surveyors have to act within the public interest, and they need to act independently when providing building surveying services. The code requires that building surveyors avoid situations that could compromise their impartiality. So they must not participate or give advice on the development of designs or performance solutions before or after they're accepting an engagement to be the relevant building surveyor. Now, this also applies to statutory and consultant building surveyors who are employed in the same office. So if a consultant is providing design advice and then another building surveyor from the same office is accepting the appointment, that would be an example of inappropriate conduct. In terms of acting in the public interest, a consultant building surveyor will have responsibility when involved in performance solutions. So this might be a scenario where a performance solution is suggested by the consultant building surveyor and it enables upfront cost savings. However, increased maintenance costs for future owners who are not involved in the development or the construction process. The building surveyor in that circumstance would need to raise this in their advice to be acting in the public interest. This might impact the way that some building surveyors currently operate, and the VBA will include the code of conduct in our auditing arrangements to ensure building surveyors are meeting their new obligations or new and existing obligations. So we're on to part 4, which is our performance solution example. And we're just going to go through the process as it would apply to this scenario. So we've got a pretty simple scenario here, and it's just this 4-step process I discussed earlier, which is in this circumstance, a level entry threshold for a Class 1A building. So in this circumstance, the owner wants this to enhance the accessibility, and the design team have determined that the best way to achieve this is a performance solution. Now we have our main performance requirement on screen, which is 221, P221. And the DTS options under the BCA are compliant with AS NZS 3500 Part 3, which is the stormwater drainage standard, or we can comply with the acceptable construction practice, which is stepping down, etc. In our scenario, neither is being achieved, so a performance solution is required. In terms of how this 4-step process looks, in the performance-based design brief, we would outline the design objectives, which are to provide a step-free entry whilst also disposing of the surface water. We'd outline who we would consult during this process, which is the owner, the designer, the builder, an engineering consultant and the building surveyor. We'd basically provide an overview of the BCA provisions. So at this point, we're establishing compliance is not being proposed, and then we're using a performance solution. We'd go through all those steps of identifying the performance requirements, which we just did, which is P221, and then the DTS provisions that we're not meeting. We then identify wider impacts in terms of other aspects of the code. And this will be things like termite management could be impacted, for instance, so we'd need to take that into consideration in the performance solution process. We'd outline the evidence we're proposing. So in this case, we'll assume it's a report from an engineer that's containing calculations and drawings, which is using evidence of suitability. In Victoria, that would need to be done by someone who's registered in the prescribed category or class, so someone who's a registered engineer in the specific class. In terms of our analysis component, the engineer would develop this report that contains drawings, and they'd basically calculate the disposal of surface water. So this would consider things like the roof cover over the area, the rainfall intensity, which is key to our performance requirement, and then things like wind direction and the means of disposal that might impact on the solution. Once the engineer's done that, they would evaluate the results and produce a report that includes the calculations, the drawings, and then basically all the information they're using to support the performance solution. They then produce this final report, and this contains the details of the last 3 steps, a copy of the performance-based design brief, the engineering report that they've prepared, all the drawings that are necessary, and the calculations that justify the proposal. This would also include specific details about any limitations that are proposed, and such as maintenance obligations, so it might impose maintenance obligations on how the owner has to deal with that space. Once that's completed, the report can be submitted to the RBS for approval with all the other building permit documentation and the application. That's essentially how it would look for a really simple process, and it can be very short, so extremely important to understand. Now we're just going to try to swiftly go through this part because we're running out of time, I can see. We're on to our part 5, which is code mark. Now, we discussed earlier that code marks are a form of evidence of suitability. Now, they make very specific claims of compliance against parts of the BCA, and they're either deemed to satisfy all performance requirements or both in some circumstances. The certificates are subject to limitations and conditions. And what that is it aligns to how the material or product's been generally tested, or the evidence that's been given to the certification body. Now we've got a code mark on screen that's for a product, and it claims compliance against some specific deemed to satisfy provisions. Now in our circumstance, we've got really specific limitations, and that is that if it's included in a wall system as a whole, it's outside the scope and requires consideration to the building surveyor. So it's only looking specifically at the, in this case, it's a cladding product. There are no claims of compliance against anything for a structural aspect or our weatherproofing performance requirement that I suggested earlier. So we'd require a performance solution to confirm compliance with both of these. The code mark has a really specific limitation that it needs a project-specific engineering assessment. In this specific case, if we were to meet all relevant performance requirements, we need to consider the code mark as only meeting the requirements that it's claiming compliance against, and then look at the limitations and then use other deemed to satisfy all performance solutions to confirm compliance from a holistic perspective. We commonly see code mark certificates relied upon in building permit documentation. However, they very rarely consider the holistic compliance of the BCA. Now, this is really important for things like fire resistance, structural adequacy, and weatherproofing. So if things are being specified, it's very important that designers understand when they're specifying something, the specific type of evidence that they're using, and whether there's anything that's not considered that they'd need to make sure is covered. It's really important that code mark certificates, BRAC certificates, all of these things aren't used outside the intended application unless they're supported by some type of specific performance solution. Now, if we look at an updated version of the same certificate, you'll notice straight away that it claims compliance against some performance requirements. So we've got performance requirements from section B, for instance, and P for volume 2, so P211. And it's also claiming compliance against things like weatherproofing. So this certificate explains the limitations of compliance like the last one. However, it's an example of a more holistic type consideration to performance requirements. Now, when considering to rely on the certificate, we're basically saying that to meet things like our BP or our P211, which are structural, and our weatherproofing performance requirements as well, we'd still need to check that the maximum loads for the project don't exceed what's specified in the certificate. And in the circumstances that they do, we'd need to provide the building surveyor with some other type of evidence to confirm compliance. So really understanding when we're specifying products that we understand the limitations, and then if there are a limitation that it's exceeding, it's addressed via some type of specific solution. Now we're moving on to our Q&A session. So there is a function, the Q&A function, where you can ask questions. So Andrew and I are both available to answer any questions people have. So highly encourage everyone to answer or to ask questions.
Thanks, Matt, for the presentation. Also, just forgot to mention at the beginning as well, at the conclusion of the webinar, there'll be a survey that will pop up on your screen. We encourage you to fill that out and provide us some feedback as well. We've had a number of good questions. We've answered a few of those as we've gone. We'll hope to answer a few of those more in the sort of 10 minutes that we've got left. So I might tackle the first one. Is a performance solution, e.g. under FP 1.4, transferable from project to project, e.g. waterproof blockwork, may be similar across a range of projects? So that's an interesting one that we've struggled a little bit with as well, but we would suggest that provided it applies to each site, so the risks are that you've got site-specific issues to consider. So each performance solution may vary from site to site, but if it is not necessarily site specific or the site has exactly the same conditions and applicability, then we would think that that would be an appropriate process. And we're sort of understanding that there are, I think, more provisions within the building codes than most sort of currently acknowledged that don't have deemed to satisfy provisions and do need some performance provision, and that's going to sort of be quite cumbersome from a documentary process. I think where we're heading at the moment is that the process will be a little bit top heavy. We're keen on sort of exploring how we can facilitate that process and still get the right outcome. I'll hand to you, Matt, for another one.
Yep, I'll go. What if the consultant building surveyor has a different opinion to the RBS? A lot of money could be spent doing the performance solution recommended by the consultant surveyor only to have it refused by the RBS. So really good point there. So the key to this is that really when the performance-based design brief is being developed, the relevant building surveyor is also a stakeholder in that. And when the acceptance criteria is being developed, it's reasonable to ask the building surveyor, who's the relevant building surveyor, whether they'll accept the solution if the acceptance criteria is met. So that will give that certainty in terms of ensuring that the RBS will accept it if that criteria is met. So that's how that's kind of mitigated.
And I'd suggest also that potentially there's the Building Appeals Board if it does go totally pear-shaped. If there is a difference of opinion, hopefully they can sort of have some alignment there. Got another one. When an owner provides all documents, all report, engineering, slab design approved by building surveyor, then the slab heaves 159 millimetres, who's at fault? Probably not directly related to performance solutions, but and it's probably a little bit difficult to answer without further details because it could be multiple parties. The original engineer, the soil tester not sort of undertaking soil appropriately, maintenance on the site. So there's a number of things. I am aware that there may be some issues with footings, and it's something we're having a look at. So probably if anyone does have some personal experience in that space, it'd be good to hear from you just so we can be able to feed into that exercise. Matt, you got another one?
Yep. So is it for the builder to read, understand and implement the performance solution report, or is it for the designer architect to translate the report on the drawings? It's a bit of a mixed bag, that one. So it's a responsibility of really both parties in a certain way. So the builder needs to implement the design. If it's elements that can be shown on the architectural drawings, it's up to the architect or building designer, whatever the case is, to show that to a sufficient level to assist the builder, but the builder needs to be aware of the report and the drawings.
Right. Another question. Can an owner withdraw from appointing a building surveyor once appointment has been made and signed? So generally no, but there is a provision for the building surveyor to be terminated. That would require the owners, the current RBS. and that application would need to be made to the VBA, and then the VBA would consider termination of the RBS. The concerns there are that we just need to make sure that the termination is for appropriate reasons. So it's not a case of shopping around for the right answers or the performance solution outcome that they might need, that it is due to other valid reasons of the RPS no longer being able to perform those duties, or other valid reasons.
Yep. I think the Phil Lang question at the top there, Andrew, is the preceding one from the slab heave question.
Yep.
So yeah, it's more of a litigation question. So we might it would depend on the specific situation in terms of liability. Why is it only a registered engineer suitable to produce the performance solution in the example I provided? So in that case, that's because the Victorian legislation varies the evidence of suitability provisions in the BCA, and it requires that when a report or certificate's provided, it's by a registered engineer in the category or class. So that's why it would need to be by someone who's registered in that circumstance.
Got another one. Many installed cladding made of solid aluminium sheets and not ACP or honeycomb panels, such as Vitriol G2, which has potential combustibility interlayer. Aluminium is not currently classified as non-combustible under the NCC, other than testing to AS 1530 Part 1, which I believe is an overkill. To prove non-combustibility, would VBA accept experts' opinion? So there is actually a section within the building code that has a number of acceptable products that are deemed non-combustible, and one of those is pre-finished metal. So I would suggest that solid aluminium would come under that exemption, and if it was tested 1530 Part 1, collar bond and other pre-finished metals would actually fail because of the paint coat that would provide some flaming that means they fail the 1530 Part 1 test. So but aluminium would come under that pre-finished metal concession. Might have opportunity for one more, and then there's a few more there, but we might sort of pick some of those out and hopefully address them separately.
Yeah. For what building components does a builder need code mark? Code mark, unlike watermark, isn't mandatory, so it would ultimately depend on what element you would need code mark for to determine or to demonstrate that it complied. So that's very situational, extremely difficult to answer, but it would really depend on the circumstance, but yeah, not mandatory.
So I'd like to thank you all for attending. I appreciate the number of people that have taken some time out of their busy days in these unusual circumstances we find ourselves in now. As mentioned, I'd really appreciate if you could fill out the survey after this. That will help inform us in future for our presentations. Thank you all for attending, and look forward to attendance at future VBA events. Thank you.